Good morning. How are you?
Good morning.
It's nice to be back here in Hong Kong. And thank you, Professor Ming Wen, and thank you, Professor Eric Fong, for your invitation, and thank you, Professor Fong, for your kind introduction. And I would also like to thank the Vice Provost, Ian Holliday, for joining us in the session. And thank you for the invitation to bring us here to join you in celebrating the launch of the University of Hong Kong Research Hub on Population Studies, and to have me here to speak at the inaugural conference on global demographic challenges and opportunities in Asia. So in this presentation, I would like to reflect on some major trends and theoretical formulations of international migration, transnationalism, and development since the 1990s, when the world has entered a new phase of hyper-globalization. So I would like to touch on three things. One is a brief description of the contemporary trend of international migration, and then reflecting on theories of migration and development. And then when I have time, I want to discuss some of the things on understanding intra-Asian migrations from a global South perspective. So since the 1980s, rapidly globalizing economies, ever-improving means of transportation and information communication technology, and the increasingly intertwined social networks have enabled unprecedented movements of people around the world. By recent count of the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, 281 million people, or 3.6% of world's population, nearly half of them women, were international migrants in 2020, compared to less than 100 million in 1980. Like those immigrants who moved in earlier years prior to 1970, contemporary international immigrants tend to head for developed countries in the global north. However, since the 1990s, as you see here, destinations are not entirely those of the global north. Now, about 45% of them actually move and live in parts of the developing global south. So within Asia, as you can see, Asian migration is increasingly significant. About 31% of the international migrants are now live in Asia, just as many as those living in Europe. The United States takes the lion's share, hosting the largest number of international immigrants, at about 51 million, or 18% of total. Next is Germany. Still, among the top 10 destination countries to the left, quite a few are in the global south, including Saudi Arabia, Russia, UAE, Australia, France, and Spain. Top 10 sending countries are India, Mexico, Russia, China, Syria, Arab Republic. Note that Russia not only serves as the top 4 receiving countries, but also the top 3 sending countries. So that's a trend of contemporary migration. So this slide zooms in on the top 4 receiving and sending countries. Note that international migrants are not evenly distributed across the globe. Rather, they are highly concentrated. Although you will find them in every country on earth, like the Chinese, 70% of them concentrate in just 20 countries, and nearly a third concentrate in the top 4 countries of destination. So here is a chart of Chinese immigration to the US from 1960 to 1919. Over 10 million Chinese immigrants are now living outside China. About a quarter are in the US. As you see, the Chinese immigrants to the US have been on the rise despite a slight drop in the 2010s. Even during COVID years, the volume remained highly increasing from 40,000 in 2020 to 52,000 annually in 2021. And remember, the per country ceiling is 20,000, right, in the United States. So highly visible concentration of new immigrant populations in traditional and new destination countries have stimulated constant transnational flows as well. These migrations are extremely diverse, marked by hyperdiversity, that is diverse not only across national origins, but also within different social categories like gender, ethnicity, race, and so forth. Women comprise nearly half of the international migrant population, and more than half in Latin America. In Asia, about 40% of the international migrants are from Asian countries. So, and there are also various in types, including labor migrants. Among labor migrants, highly skilled migrants and low-skilled migrants. Both highly skilled migrants and low-skilled migrants also face the precarity of being undocumented or losing their status once they are there. So it also includes merchants, traders, investors, as well as returnees and transmigrants, that is those who move regularly across the sending country and the receiving country. So undocumented migrants comprise about 15% of the total immigrant population. And then with that, there are also a significant number of refugees and asylees, about 31 million. And that is not counting for the internally displaced populations, that is 55 million. So next, let me reflect on some of the theories on migration and development. We know that migration scholars actually are concerned with two sets of questions. One is the causes of migration, the other is the consequences. That is, causes why and how people move. And secondly is the consequences. The consequences are actually two sets of consequences. One is upon arrival in a host country, how well immigrants adapt or integrate into their host country or their new homeland, so to speak. And then second set of question is how immigrants affect developments both in home country and in the host country. But then migration scholars pay much more attention to homeland development than host society development. So first, why people move? So we see the old model, right? In his classic paper, The Law of Migration in 1885, the British scholar Ernest George Ravenstein identified the fundamental tendencies guiding long-distance migrations, especially rural to urban migrations, suggesting that economic causes are the most important drivers for human movement. The economic motivation for migration are at the core of what comes to be called the push-pull model. People are pushed out of some places by economic circumstances such as low wages, unemployment, or underemployment, poverty, and famine, and pulled by the economic advantages offered by other locations. The push-pull forces are consequential, increasing emigration from migrant-sending places while increasing economic development in migrant-receiving places. Most explanations of international migration in modern times have been generally consistent with Ravenstein's law of migration. However, the idea that migrants simply leave economically undeveloped or underdeveloped rural locations for economically burgeoning urban locations, or that they simply leave home for a foreign land, seems to attribute human movement to spontaneous responses to differences in wages and in economic circumstances, and does not account for why people move from some specific locations to others. So the next major classic model is birth of passage. Michael Piori in 1979 published a book, a study looking mainly at the turn of the 20th century migration, arguing that migrants do not decide to move entirely on their own, but they are recruited by labor-seeking enterprises in developed economies. Moreover, because of their economic motivation, migrants tend to be birds of passage, seeking to earn money and then return home. Permanent settlement is a byproduct. While this part of Piori's argument may not be applicable to all international migrant groups, it does serve as a reminder that many migrants do retain close ties to their homeland, and that they do so via the sending of remittances. Piori argued further that industries recruit workers to do what natives will not do, pointing to the demand for labor from the perspective of economically more developed migrant receiving places. The unavailability of native labor is generally the consequences of economies divided into what are often called the primary and the secondary or core versus peripheral sectors. Migrant workers were brought in because jobs need to be done, but few native workers are interested in taking them. One inference that we can draw from this is that native workers tend to move from transient to secure positions in the primary sector, while foreigners feel the labor demand in the secondary sector of the economy, hence labor market segmentation by national origin and immigration status. So next, classic model is the structural imbalances and context. To account for why labor recruitment in more advanced economies takes place, either overtly or through the spread of information, one would need to consider how different countries or regions are interconnected. Thinking along these lines of globalization and the World System Organization, Alejandro Portis and John Walton argued that migration is a consequence of the penetration of the economies or structures of more advanced countries in the core, or in today's term, the global north, into less advanced countries, creating structural imbalances of opportunities and expectations. Saskia Sassen extends this idea of imbalance using the notion of contact to describe how labor and capital flow across national borders to economically interconnected countries and regions. And next is the social network model. The idea of contact may be applied not only at the macro level, the contact of one economy with another, but also at the micro level, the contact of individuals in one location with those in another, or perhaps even more commonly, the contact among individuals in the same location with knowledge of opportunities and resources. Social network theory of migration micro-level implications of the view that immigration is the consequence of how countries as economic actors are interconnected at the level of individual, family, and migrant organizations. These scholars stress the importance of social network in creating and sustaining migrant flow. Networks connect employers in receiving regions and workers in a sending region and also create pathways of support and information flow along the lines of immigrant families and communities. The network approach within a perspective of globalization is a useful corrective to Piore's one-sided emphasis on recruitment by actors in the host country. So one critique of the classical theory is that the dichotomy of international migration into two broad categories, political and economic. Underlying the political category is a moral call for helping refugees and asylees based on the Declaration of the Universal Human Rights of the United Nations that thrive in international legal systems. The economic category, in contrast, makes a general assumption in that all other migrants are motivated by economic interests, implying that individual migrants' voluntary choices can be accomplished in the open market and that their movement back and forth are market-driven. However, we argue that putting all migrants, except for refugees and asylees, into a single category makes it analytically difficult to distinguish between, for instance, those motivated by actual economic circumstances or opportunities and those driven by a variety of non-economic factors, such as marriage, retirement, and even military deployment abroad. Moreover, such conceptualization that is dichotomizing immigrants into the economic category or political category leads to a normative differentiation between economic migrants, those with desirable skills migrating through legal channels, versus those deemed liabilities or burdens in the host country. Another critiques include how classical theories overlook the role of the role of immigration regimes at the macro level, that is liberal versus restrictive policies responding both to economic needs and to citizen concerns. It also overlooked the role of non-governmental institutions at the meso level, such as NGOs and also migration intermediaries, the migration industries that has been thrive to facilitate migrant flows. As well as to ignore the interaction or overlook the interaction between government and migrant intermediaries, between migration intermediaries and social network. The two of them are different. And migrant social network and individual migrants. So there is also the problem of methodological nationalism, that is to take nation state as given, consider nation state as the basic unit of analysis. So in present theoretical formulation, there is a call for going beyond the nation state. Now, why the need of going beyond the nation state? First, globalization and technological development blur nation-state borders, but the border is still formidable, not to ignore the role of the border. But neither nation-states nor migrant lives are contained within territorially boundaries of nation-states. Also, not only nation-states immigration regimes, that is immigration policies that manage migrants at the border, but also international organizations are involved in shaping terrains of migrations. There is a saying that, the border crosses people rather than people cross border. And then there is also the role of the role and ability of nation states to ensure human rights and labor rights are limited. So again, in terms of the second set of questions, like once immigrants arrive in their country, so there has been the prevailing theories on migrant adaptation. So one is the classical assimilation theory. The classical assimilation theory assumes that there is a mainstream in the host country dominated by a core culture. So the process of assimilation is a natural process by which diverse ethnic groups come to share a common culture and gain equal access to the opportunity structure of the host society. And second assumption of the classical assimilation theory is to assume that immigrants came from inferior culture vis-a-vis host culture. So this process entails the gradual abandonment of overall cultural and behavioral patterns in favor of the new one. And the third assumption of the classical theory is a linear and unidimensional trajectory, implying that the process, once set in motion, it will move inevitably and irreversibly towards assimilation. So there is a critique of this classical theory. Critics say that the classical theory overestimates the allegiance of migrants to the old culture, to the attachment of the culture that they left behind. It also overemphasized the impersonal and structural forces, neglecting agency, that is, people have choices to make opportunities available to them, and also overlook the group level, SES, group level socioeconomic characteristics and the interaction effect of those. And then there is another theory that we developed by Alejandro Portes and myself, the segmented assimilation theory, is aimed as a middle-range theory to kind of correct the problems posed by the classical theory. So we also have three different assumptions. One is American society. We focus more on America. American society is stratified, or the whole society is stratified by class and race, especially by class if you apply to other countries. And then the mainstream is dominated in America by the white middle class. Now that is different from the Asian countries as receiving country, and I will say this shortly. And then assimilation, rather than unidimensional, is multidimensional and segmented. So we observe several major outcomes of social mobility. One is upward path, integration and consonant acculturation into mainstream or the white middle class, and that's the classic path predicted by classic assimilation. And the second path is a downward path that is integration and dissonant acculturation into the host society's margins. So if you assimilate into the host society's margins, you are just assimilated, right? And then there is another path that is quite the contrary, predicted by the classical assimilation theory, that is integration and selective acculturation into the middle class via the ethnic community. In other words, you don't have to shed your ethnic baggage or burdens in order to assimilate. If anything, under certain circumstances, your ethnicity or the ethnic community can generate resources conducive to social mobility and assimilation. So the segmented assimilation actually asks two sets of questions. One is what determines divergent outcome? Why outcome are divergent within group as well as across group? And then what what are the significant differences in outcome by national origin? So we kind of focus on the intersection effect of SES and national origin. And then also we bring in the notion of hyperselectivity as opposed to hyperselectivity to capture the group level SES that could be explained why some ethnic community are resourceful, whereas others are not. So hyperselectivity refers to an immigrant group whose proportion of college graduates that are higher than not only than the sending country, but also the receiving country. Hyperselectivity is the opposite. So we have a lot of immigrants are highly selected, right? But not many immigrant groups are hyper or hypo-selected. So I don't have time to expand on that, but there are some very significant and profound effect of hyperselectivity. By that count, you could also infer the effect of hyposelectivity. So because that is a group level SES. So if your group comes from a level that is hyper-selected, that means on arrival, you are already structurally assimilated. Like the Indians, the Chinese, the Koreans, on arrival, their proportion of college graduates is already significantly higher than the US general population. So that is kind of like if you are looking at how well the group is faring, they have to fare better, right? They have to fare better than the first generation. So they have favorable starting point, and then middle class reproducing middle class in the next generation. And the other effect is ethnic capital formation. That is this group level capital that is lodged in the ethnic community can benefit co-ethnic members of lower socioeconomic status. So that also explains why say Asian American children, poor, living in Chinatown, they are still excel in education better than middle class white. One of the reasons is because they have these group level ethnic resources. And then the third impact is a societal impact. If the group is hyper-selected, then the group tend to be perceived positively. Say if they are more highly educated, then the teachers would think that the children are good at school. And then when the children are perceived positively, then there is this stereotype promise effect that it leads to expected favorable outcomes. And then I'm watching out for the time. And next is the migration development nexus, and that is which causes which is more focusing on the impact of migration on development of sending countries. So there is two views, the optimistic view versus the pessimistic view. The optimistic view is to promote economic development in the global south would have the potential to reduce migration to the global north. That is, if you promote development in the sending countries, return migrants are important agents for change and innovation by sending remittances and put impact on the sending country. And when the sending country developed, that reduced the pressure for further migration. But the pessimistic view is saying not. If it depends on the migration flow. If the migration flow is permanent rather than circular, then the effect would be negative because one, it causes repressive dynamics, that is unemployment, loss of qualified workers at home, and then greater economic dependence and social inequality at home. So that creates problem at home. And then also it creates the migrant syndrome. So if there are more migration, then people tend to sit there and waiting for migration when they are depending on remittances. And so the impact of it is two sides. For permanent settlement, the impact on the home society normally is depopulation, brain drain, and the migration syndrome. But if the migration flow is transnational, is circular, then the remittances could be used for a tool for development. But then it also could help contribute to reinforcing the existing social relations of economic power and class privilege in either sending and receiving countries. And the return migrants as agent for development is referring to only those who are highly skilled immigrants. They have the ability, and also those who acquire are naturalized citizens in this host country. Okay, so I'm sorry, I'm trying to run this very fast. So lastly, I have a few slides to run on understanding intra-Asian migration from a global perspective. So the migration within Asia tend to be circular. Okay? But there are unique contexts of migration in Asia that the classic theories that I just mentioned are not sufficient to explain. So one of the uniqueness of Asian migration is the extreme variations in development. So when we are thinking about the poor countries and receiving countries and sending countries, we have the very extreme richest and poorest and most developed and least developed countries. They are all sending as well as receiving. And then in Asian countries, there are liberal democracies. So varies from liberal democratic to secular to totalitarian and religious fundamentalist regimes. So you kind of see the different regimes on a spectrum as well. And that's very unique in Asia. And then also in Asian countries, there is a torn between nation building and global integration. So domestically, there is always a citizen cry to maintain ethno-national identity and also for social harmony and social security, national security. And then the other one from that kind of contradiction is the host society's mainstream. There is no mainstream in host society. Even when you see Hong Kong or Singapore, right, Japan, the mainstream is blurred. It's not as explicit as like in the United States. And then there is also the contradiction between highly restrictive immigration regimes and high demand for immigrant labor. Last night we talked about the low fertility, the need for labor, right? So there is a high demand for immigrant labor. So regimes, on the one hand, they are restrictive, and they are also highly selective, try to get immigrants of similar ethno-national characteristics, but Asian countries actually cannot do that. So they end up allowing immigrants of different ethno-national characteristics to come in, and then they have high control. And for immigrants themselves, there is the contradiction between high aspiration and block mobility. And then, so for intra-Asian migrants, they share similar motivations. So one is economic security. They also share the motivations of political stability, similar to other world migrants. So in Asia, transiency is very significant, that is temporality. There are business people, student mobility, and temporary labor, and migration is very gender. If you're looking at Filipino migration, right, a lot of domestic workers that are predominant women, and then there are construction workers that are predominantly men. And so there are also, as I mentioned, there are different migration pathways. There are labor migration, but labor migration facilitated by the immigration industry, and also labor migration facilitated by the state, as well as by the migration industries. So there are formal and informal, selective and feminized trends. So I don't, and then there is also intra-ethnic and inter-ethnic kind of migration, like Chinese migration to Singapore and Taiwan, ethnic Korean Chinese migration to South Korea, East Asian migration to Japan and so forth, Indonesian migration to Malaysia. And then there is also the notion of steppe migration. That means that migrants are moving from one country to another, not because they voluntarily want to do that, but they are forced to do that because of the restrictive immigration regime. Stepwise migration is not just applied for low-skilled workers, but also for highly skilled workers in Asia. So that's what we try to develop, develop a global South perspective to understand Asia on the move. So I just want to conclude because I saw the note here. So what is known, reflecting on theories, we know a lot about the origins of international migration, including the contemporary strand of migration from the global South and within the global South. So we see that migration and development are two parts of the same process, two coins of the same process. We also know a lot about how labor is used or is utilized. And then we know the stability and directionality of flows over time. So over time, there is this tendency to move to advanced countries, but in between there is a lot of movement within the developing or less developed countries as well. So we know that. We also know a whole lot about what determines outcome, what determines migration and development. Hometown development, we know that, permanent migration is negative to hometown development, but circular or transnational migration is positive to hometown development. So we know that. So what is less known? Less known about the unique features, patterns, and dynamics of migration within the global South. I just began to think about some of the things that I just mentioned with regard to intra-Asian migration. So we don't know, within the global South, we don't know much about how the structure and agency intersect. And the migration development nexus, there has been study on that, but still there aren't sufficient theories to explain the variations of these impacts. Even when we say we know that permanent versus circular migration have variation on impact. And then we also don't know much about the impact of international migration on the social change in the receiving countries within the global South. Right? So the reason for these knowledge gaps is that migration research is deeply influenced by concepts, paradigms, and theories, perspective, and methodologies that have been developed from the worldview and experience of the global North. Still do, but we are trying to kind of change that. And then there are insufficient data, especially comparative data. Even though data are now become more abundant than before, but still there is a need to that. And most significantly for the migration stream is that migration is constantly evolving and flexible. So this global flow, that constant evolving and flow nature of this global flow pose a lot of challenges for us to think theoretically and also do future research. So we have a lot to do, even though my time is running out, but there are a lot of young scholars around here, so I hope that, that this stimulates some discussion. Thank you very much.